All right, great. Well, let's get started. So welcome everyone, and good morning, and thanks for joining our Bench2Market talk today. Today's topic is going to be Tales from the Trenches, where we talk to some academic innovators about their journey to entrepreneurship. I'm John Nikosha, and I work with the Biolocity team, and we're organizing this talk series in collaboration with our partners at the Petit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, as well as the Georgia Clinical and Translational Science Alliance. So just to look at our schedule coming up, we've got a few other topics coming up in the next few months here about various commercialization issues. So please take a look at our calendar on Biolocity's website, where we'll be posting registration links as they become available. So a quick plug for our next Bench2Market talk series. This is going to be on December 8th at 11:30 a.m. And this is going to be on IP strategy for patentability, freedom to operate, prior art, and patent strategies. And I'm excited about this talk. This will actually be with a former colleague of mine from Emory's Tech Transfer Office, Dr. Sarah Wilkening. She's now a patent agent at Troutman Pepper, and we'll be speaking with her and one of their other partners at Troutman about their work with academic innovators. So kind of a crash course for IP. All right, additionally, I wanted to point out some other commercialization resources that we have available through Biolocity. One of these are legal office hours that are offered in partnership with the Emory School of Law and with Professor Nicole Morris. So if you're interested in learning more about IP, or if you've got a specific question about it, please feel free to schedule a meeting on Biolocity's website. I also wanted to point out that there are funding opportunities available through BARDA as well, a government agency involved in health security. We are part of the BARDA Drive Accelerator Network, and BARDA will occasionally push out various areas of interest for funding and partnership. I have a few listed here, many of which are related to the ongoing pandemic, and others that are related more broadly to things like sepsis or technologies for needleless delivery of therapeutics and vaccines. So if you have a technology that you think might fit here for health security and you're interested in speaking with BARDA, please reach out to our team and we'd be happy to schedule a meeting with them. All right, so on to our panel for today. So like I said, my name is John. I'm the Associate Director of the Biolocity Program, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Also on the panel, we have James Dolman. He's an Associate Professor in the Georgia Tech BME Department, as well as a co-founder and board member of his first spin-out company, Guide Therapeutics, which was recently acquired by Beam Therapeutics. And he's been a repeat customer for Biolocity as well. He came back and is recently working on his second project, Twice Therapeutics, as well. Our second panel member is Kenny Offerman. Kenny is a former academic herself, was a professor at Emory University for many years, before taking on various roles in industry and investing, before leading the effort for her current startup company, Oncospherics. And so she'll be talking about her journey from academia and what she's working on now. And then finally, we have James Rains. Some of you may be familiar with James. He's a professor of the practice at Georgia Tech BME, as well as the director of the BME Capstone program for undergraduate BME students. And he's also the CEO of Jackson Medical, another spin out from Georgia Tech in the medical device space. So I'm really excited to introduce all of you to our panelists today. And I think to start with, maybe we could have the panelists just give a short introduction to themselves, a little bit about their background, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. And then I have a couple of questions prepared as well. But for the audience that's here, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box. And I'll handle those and field those to the panel as well. So why don't we start off with James Dolman, give a little background about yourself.
Great. So thanks, John. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy pre-holiday schedule to hang out with us for an hour. My name is James. I'm an associate professor in the McCamish Foundation Early Career Professor here in Biomedical Engineering at Tech and Emory. My lab is focused on RNA therapy, mRNA therapies, which, until very recently, I had to explain why that was important, but now I think that has changed. We specifically focus on delivering, making these mRNA therapies so that they work in new tissues. And we do this through a technology called DNA barcoding. That was the foundation for my first company. And so we have a bit of experience in the translational space. And I also want to put in a plug for Biolocity. The program has been very helpful Both times we've used it, it's been really awesome. So thanks, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, James. How about you, Kenny?
So I am Kenny Offerman, the CEO of Oncospherics. I'm trained as both a medical oncologist and tumor biologist, and was on the faculty at Emory for many years, where I rose through the ranks. And it was there that I met the founding scientist of Oncospherics. I left Emory to go to the American Cancer Society as vice president of research, where I was for 3.5 years, and could kind of step back from my own research and look more broadly about what's going on in the world of cancer research, and from very basic discoveries through clinical application. I then moved into the world of doing some consulting, including serving as the founding medical director of a cancer center in Asheville, North Carolina, and then ultimately reconnected with a professor at Emory, Erwin van Meer, who had been developing small molecules that inhibit the HIF family of transcription factors. And he had been collaborating with Bing Wang at Georgia State, who's a chemist. And they had done more than 10 years of work, which was quite sophisticated as far as mechanism of action and demonstrating efficacy, but they hadn't licensed their technology. And to make a long story short, we stepped in initially as consultants to understand some of the challenges that they were facing, and saw huge potential. And so got funding from the Georgia Research Alliance that helped with the foundation of Oncospherics, and since then have taken off. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks. And on to you, James.
All right, so I'm James. Prior to being at Georgia Tech, I worked at Stryker and Smith & Nephew, developing new technologies and doing some IP stuff there. Then I came to Georgia Tech 9.5 years ago. And during my time here, we spun out a company called Jackson Medical. And I'm actually talking about in the trenches. I'm in the trenches right now. I'm here in Austin, Texas, trying to sell our product to a bunch of hospital systems here. And it's been a wonderful experience. And kind of like James Dahlman was saying, I mean, Biolocity has been great, as well as several other groups there in Atlanta. And I feel like we're so fortunate to have these wonderful resources who want to help entrepreneurs go from an idea all the way to commercialization. And even though I'm a panelist, I feel like I'm really more in the audience. I'm excited to hear James and Kenny tell their story. I think their stuff is fascinating. So I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So
Totally.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to tell my story.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I totally agree. I'm really excited for this conversation. And as one final quick plug for Biolocity, our funding cycle is currently open. So if you or anyone that you know has a technology that's looking for some commercialization support, please feel free to reach out to us and apply to our funding cycle or request a meeting with us. So I guess my first question for the panel, I guess we'll start at the beginning. So I want to learn a little more about how you came up with your startup project, what problem you were trying to solve, and kind of when you thought that this was like an idea that was worthy of your time and effort as a startup founder. Maybe we can start with Kenny. Sure.
All righty. Well, I had the advantage that there were more than 10 years worth of work that had been done by Erwin van Meer and his collaborators in looking at the potential of targeting the HIF family of transcription factors for cancer therapeutics, including having identified and optimized some compounds with pretty detailed mechanism of action. And so basically what they were doing was taking tumors. Tumors grow faster than their blood supply. And as a consequence, low oxygen or hypoxia there. And the tumor cells fight back. They adapt by activation of HIF transcription factors that drive over 100 genes that help tumors survive and spread. Erwin Van Meer and Bing Wang had developed inhibitors that blocked this whole process, and they had shown efficacy in multiple mouse models. So my job was relatively easy. I'm an oncologist and tumor biologist, and so understood the elegance of the science as well as the medical need. And so then the issue is, why hadn't their technology already been licensed? And part of the problem is they weren't thinking from the perspective of an end user. They were looking at the compounds as standalone agents working in these regions of hypoxia. But for a clinician to use them, you're going to want to target the well-oxygenated areas as well. So we initially got funding from Georgia Research Alliance to answer two questions. Number one, can you safely give their compounds with cytotoxic agents, standard chemotherapy? And then second, is there any evidence of synergy? And the answer was yes to both questions. And so that led to the formation of Oncospherics. And so I had the advantage of kind of coming in from the outside and taking advantage of more than 10 years worth of work, as well as having that broad understanding of what's going on in the cancer arena by having both been a medical oncologist and also having seen what was coming down the pipeline through the research portfolio at the American Cancer Society.
Great, thanks. I love that perspective of thinking about the problem, not as a researcher that's been, wed to these compounds as their primary kind of research focus for years, but really thinking about this from the perspective of an investor or an industry partner that might want to make a product out of this. And I think that's probably going to be a through line for a lot of these conversations is, when does research become a product, and what does that process really look like? So thanks for that. How about you, James Rains? Too many James.
Okay, so mine was a bit of a circuitous path, actually. Our funding when we started off actually was for an orthopedic implant. And we spent time on that and really, you're building your business thesis, doing all this voice of the customer. And then we realized there were just some technical challenges with it. And we actually pivoted into otolaryngology, which is still not the area that we are now. And then we went down that path and we realized that we had a great idea, but nobody would buy it and nobody would use it. So then we pivoted back over to orthopedics and went down that path more. And then talked to all these customers and realized we did not have a business thesis that would really hold up. And so we actually met, I can remember the day of the conference, we met in the bar and decided if we were going to quit or if we were going to pivot to something else. So then we decided we were going to give it another try. And we pivoted to something else that we had actually seen a lot in surgery. We had watched all these doctors that would, whenever they were doing a scope procedure, they would take this light cable and they would lay it on the drape, which is a fire risk. But when you would talk to them afterwards, you would ask them about it and they would say, oh, rule number one is you never lay it on the drape. That's rule number one. Residents may make that mistake or other doctors, but I certainly don't do that. But yet they did it in all these procedures. And so that showed us there was a real problem. So we started working with a group called GCMI, which several of you may know. They're a great resource. And we started making prototypes and we were showing it to nurses and doctors, and they all started responding very, very well to it. And that's when we knew we had something that could turn into a business, because all of them would say, wow, I wish I'd have come up with something like this because this is a real problem. So that's really how we started getting serious about this and moving forward with it. And there were some great resources on campus, Biolocity and some other things we can talk about later. But that's how we knew, but it was not just this clear and easy path forward. There were a lot of curves and turns, and somehow we ended up here.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate that because I think very few entrepreneurs would describe their path as a straight shot to the finish line. So you've got to be agile and willing to change paths. Cool. Thanks for sharing. How about you, James?
Yeah. So the problem that we were trying to solve was really an issue of supply and demand. Since our company was acquired, the supply and demand issue has actually gotten worse or better, depending on what side of the aisle you're on. And there's an oversupply, there's actually a lot of demand right now for drug delivery systems that can deliver RNA drugs around the body. So, if you want to have an RNA drug and get injected and deliver that RNA drug to the heart or to the lung or to whatever, so that you can treat a disease in the heart or lung, there's basically a huge demand for this, but there isn't any supply for those vehicles. The delivery vehicles actually do it. And so what we developed in the lab was a way to find delivery vehicles very, very quickly. And it's all based around, again, this DNA barcoding approach, but it essentially allows you to run a few hundred to a few thousand experiments, drug delivery experiments, seeing where everything goes, all in one animal. So instead of having to say, well, I don't really know how to get this to the heart, I don't know how to design something that's going to get to the heart, I can make 5,000 different variants, but then I have to run a 25,000 mouse experiment. Instead, you could test a few hundred of those variants all in one animal. And so it was just a very, very high throughput way of doing a really important experiment, which is how do you get an RNA drug to go to the heart, to the lung, or whatever. And that was basically the thought process behind the company. And then once we kind of got the company going, then we were very fortunate in that the science that we launched the company with was really robust. And so we were able to, generate piles and piles of data very, very quickly with a small team. And then, as the folks around the panel here know, a lot of these things are very momentum based. And so once you kind of catch momentum, then it builds on itself. And so we were very fortunate to kind of catch some momentum based on those data. And then everything moved really quickly after that. But it was all based on this idea, how do you get something to go to the heart? We don't know. I can't run a 25,000 mouse experiment. How do I solve that problem? And that's what we went after.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I think this really gets at the core of, unmet need and different ways to sort of identify that. A couple of you mentioned different resources on campus that have helped you sort of advance your technology and get you to where you are. So I'd love to hear more about what was helpful to you, whether that was Biolocity or GRA, GCMI, and kind of how you interacted with those groups and what value you got out of that. So I guess anyone feel free to jump in.
I can go. So I've interacted. What was Biolocity called beforehand? I forget.
We were the Coulter
Translational.
Yeah.
So the first company, the one that we actually spun out, was through Coulter Translational, and then Coulter Translational turned into Biolocity. So we've had two of these interactions. I'm going to speak, mainly about that first interaction because that was the one that was most ingrained into my mind. I didn't have the long and short of it is I had no idea what I was doing. I saw recently the first VC that actually invested in us. He sent me a few weeks ago the original deck I sent him. And it is a hot mess. It is so bad, so bad. And, now I look at the decks that, I might send out, for future companies, and they're going to be very, very different. And I'm sure that, whenever I do company 2, the deck will be way better. Whenever I do company 3, they'll be way better than 2. I'm sure it'll keep building or whatever, but it was a disaster, for company 1. And the folks on the Biolocity team, were very patient, and, kind of said, well, you don't want to put that in, you want to put this in. And and helped me work through sort of this fundraising 101 and how VCs work 101 and so on, which I think is frankly a skill set that you have to kind of live through to actually learn. That's at least in my experience. It's hard for me to describe the lessons that I've learned to somebody who hasn't done it before. I think you just kind of, got to get in the trenches and just kind of feel the pain a little bit, and then you learn. But Biolocity was really helpful in at least telling me what I was about to learn through pain, if that makes sense. And that was very, very helpful, because otherwise it seems scary, right? But if you're being told, okay, this is going to suck, this is going to be okay, that'll be okay, this is going to suck, that's going to suck, and then you go through the experience and it follows that pattern, then you go, okay, it's fine, right? Like, this sucks, but that's normal. So I think that was really helpful. So to bullet point 1, just making it less of a hot mess, and 2, telling me what was going to be painful, so that when it was painful, I wasn't freaked out that something was wrong. I just knew it was painful, which is 2 different things.
I think that's a great point. The pitch deck, I think, is an interesting topic as well, because I think as academics, we're comfortable with sort of a certain style of presenting information. We love to tell other people about our data. And that's one of the first things is, really figuring out how to sell yourself to a different audience and repackage the same story, just, in maybe a different kind of narrative or something. But yeah, I've heard from startup founders that they'll go through, 30 to 40 versions of a pitch deck by the time they actually get funding. So it's definitely an iterative process, and gotta be patient with yourself.
Yeah, and the investors, if you get on the other side of that table and you're on the investor side of the conversation, the investors will describe people as being too academic. And what they mean by that is like, this person can't sell worth anything. I don't care how good the science is. Like, look how terrible this deck is. Like, we can't do anything with this. Right. So it is a skill set that has to be learned, because, you can get yourself uninvited, you can get yourself, declined 9 out of 10 times if you don't have the right deck.
Yeah.
Stop out of the gate without opening your mouth. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you're right. It's trial by fire. You've got to hear the feedback and be receptive to it. But yeah, I'd love to hear from our other panelists as well. What were some resources that you found helpful, or yeah. Sure, go ahead, James. And feel free to jump in. I don't need to.
Yeah. To me, what I think everybody needs to appreciate is that there are wonderful resources here in the area that you really need to take advantage of, because these are institutions or groups that want to give you advice and help with nothing in return, which is unbelievable. And they are great resources. Biolocity has been absolutely fantastic, and the previous version of it has been fantastic. I think Venture Lab is a great group to talk to. Harold Solomon, if I could give an MVP trophy out, I'd give one to him. I think GRA has been fantastic. All of these groups have been nothing but helpful and supportive to have you focus on the different aspects of what is important, because the engineers and the scientists, they get very myopic. They fall in love with their technology or their solution, and they're forgetting that there's so many other things to focus on. You've got to figure out, is this even a business? And how is it going to be sold? How is it going to be priced? There's all these things that people do not think about. And I remember Harold Solomon, I was explaining to him about our technology and whatever, and he was like, yeah, great. But that's not the important part. The important part is the business. And he was explaining to us how we needed to focus on it. And I had my own biases. I had experience in orthopedics, and I thought I had a better handle than I really did on what it took to go from this idea to commercialization. And so to me, those are just some wonderful resources. And there's probably more that I'm forgetting that people should definitely reach out to and definitely listen to, because they're just there to help you. And, I just met with you guys recently too on a new idea, and they're just having you focus on the basics, which is making sure you're doing the voice of the customer discovery, and making sure you understand all the financials. Because if you spend 3 to 5 years developing some wonderful thing and nobody's going to buy it, you have wasted all of your time. Mm-hmm. So a failure is to continue working on an idea and spending time and money on it if there's no commercialization opportunity with it. That would be a failure, not pivoting to something else. So people kind of need to be okay with pivoting and listening to that feedback, and don't fall in love with that technology so much. The other thing too is GCMI, I thought, was a fantastic resource. They helped us out with some design and manufacturing and how to build a quality system for a company. So for medical devices, their experience and background has just been very helpful for us. So that's the Global Center for Medical Innovation, and it's right there on 14th Street. And so I think they have been a wonderful resource.
Yeah, that's great advice. How about you, Kenny?
Well, we in particular have received a lot of help from the Georgia Research Alliance. They gave us some funding before we became a company. And then after we ended up getting a $400,000 SBIR, then we got some additional grant funding from them, which has been hugely helpful. I attended a number of seminars from the Coulter group before it became Biolocity, and got some feedback from the Biolocity team, but we did not get funding from them. I started seeking funding early on through some national fora, just finding out about who ends up being, for the most part, free to be able to attend and meet with investors. And very early on, I found that Wilson Sonsini, which is a law firm in California, was having a life science investor forum. And I went there like literally a week after the company was founded and met with a few investors. And one of the things that I learned is that while the sophistication of the scientists who were doing some of the initial screening, they knew their space well, because one talks about looking at the business deck and saying that you really have to target it to investors and not have it too science focused. But you can't ignore the science either. So there has to be a pretty good understanding of the competitive landscape and where your particular company fits into that and what gives you the competitive advantage. And also, like, I'm trained as a scientist and as a medical oncologist, so I know kind of the beginning and the end, but there's this big black box in between that a lot of the drug development things, formulations, improving solubility, all kinds of things that I didn't know about, and ended up being very promiscuous in accepting invitations from contract research organizations and then talking to people, but then having someone from the Oncospherics team, having a representative overseeing the actual delivery from the CROs. And so there were definitely local organizations. There's also Southeast Bio is now Southeast Life Sciences. And so went to one of their meetings very early on. And that's where I first learned about contract research organizations, because a lot more of them approached me than investors did, much to my chagrin. Just being open to talking to a lot of different people, constantly refining, and then listening to criticisms and responding to those criticisms. And for us, one of the things we've done is look for a lot of non-dilutive funding too, with grant money, so that we can build the story. So with the investors, have a higher valuation when we go out there. So they're good resources locally, but they're good resources nationally as well. And so we've taken advantage of those as well.
Fantastic. And I think something in common that I heard from all three of you is maybe almost an element of humility kind of being required for entrepreneurship. You know, all three of our panelists have had pretty storied, successful careers before they even got into entrepreneurship. But you're always still learning things. And I think it really points out that if you're going to take this dive into a new world of entrepreneurship, you've got to be willing to hear criticism and respond to it and continually improve yourself, because there's stuff that, you know, we don't know about, whether it's drug development or the quirks of what investors are looking for or something like that. So I appreciate that perspective a lot.
I was just going to say, I tell everybody every week I'm learning something new. And so you got to put your ego to the side. And I'll tell you, yesterday at this conference, I go around to every company that is a similar startup size, maybe a few years ahead of me or a few years behind me. And I'm trying to ask them about how did they find success with this and that, and how do they handle different aspects of it? Because I'm not afraid to learn some great tip, you know, and I'm happy to share our path too. But somebody over there is going to give me advice of something we just haven't considered and something we haven't looked at before. So I love talking to people and getting advice and learning every week. I feel like I'm learning something brand new.
And I think those of us who were drawn to academia in the first place are perpetual students. We like sharing our knowledge, but we also like gaining new knowledge to share. And so it goes both ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just say that, to add on something to that, which is that you have to be, I think, even to a greater extent than I think you know we are in the academic lab. I think you have to be very willing to just accept unpleasant truths. So, you know, if you're in an academic lab and your paper doesn't get accepted in Nature, you know, you can still get it accepted in another journal. You can tell yourself it's a victory, blah, 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 right? In my experience, a lot of these business outcomes are very binary. The ink either dries on the contract or the acquisition, or it doesn't. There's very little in between. You're really either publishing in Nature or nothing. And so that, to me, means that when we go talk about business strategies or stuff like this, we talk about things that we desperately wish were X, but they turn out to be Y. And that is just the way it is. And that was a bit of a transition because, you know, usually I'm a very optimistic, well, not an optimistic person, but I try to be a cheery person. So I'm always looking for silver linings or whatever. But you know, sometimes you just have to say, like, look, I know that we would love to do this, but that is a total waste of resources, full stop. And it sucks, and it's the truth, and it doesn't matter how we feel about it, it's the truth. So I think that sort of willingness to deal with the brutal reality is absolutely required. Because if you don't deal with that reality, you're screwed. So I think, you know, to have a chance of success, you have to deal with reality, even when reality is kind of unpleasant.
And to kind of follow up on that concept is to, when you're doing experiments, to do experiments that are going to build value rather than address the intellectually curious observations that you found. And sometimes those very same experiments that build value can also kill value. So it's important, critical experiments that are going to give you a thumbs up or thumbs down on moving forward. And we are building our companies and doing the experiments and moving forward because we're optimistic, because we're convinced that that the good things are going to happen. But it's sometimes that one's assumptions are incorrect, and there's a saying in drug development or product development in general, which is kill early, kill often. So if something is not going to work, you want to find it out as soon as possible so that you can shift the resources to those things that are going to work. And we heard James talk earlier about how he kept pivoting till he finally got to something that looked like it was going to be the right direction from a business perspective. But it's the same process scientifically or business wise, is find out what is or isn't going to work as soon as possible so that you can make the needed adjustments.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's fantastic advice, kind of along the Silicon Valley mantra of fail fast. And it reminds me of something that James brought up earlier about momentum building in a startup company, because that can also work in reverse. If an investor has seen that maybe you've been working on this project for years and years and years and don't really seem to be making that much actual progress on it, they'll wonder, why is this taking so long? You know, is this really the team that I want to put my resources behind? So I totally echo that advice to, you know, find the killer experiment, as we call it, or killer experiments, and be willing to you know, kind of to leave something behind, even if it's something you've been working on. 'Cause certainly don't want to waste more resources on that. Great. So this is, I think, some really good advice about the early stages, about partners that you can find kind of in our local ecosystem and non-dilutive funding resources. I'd also like to get some perspective on how each of you were able to connect with some later stage partners, whether that's an industry or a strategic investor arm, or even venture capital investors and those types of groups. How did you kind of identify those potential partners and vet them? Yeah, if you could just kind of walk through a little bit of that process. And anyone feel free to jump in.
Kenny, go first.
Okay, well, that's an easy one for me because we're still trying to do that.
There you go.
So we initially ended up getting funding from non-dilutive sources, and so had set November 1st as our date for going after our equity raise, our Series A, and there are the potential for strategic partners, but we're still doing some preclinical work to, you know, really strengthen our case as we approach them. And this is a little bit like what John was saying, is that if you go out too soon, then you have one chance of making a good first impression. And we've tiptoed around and talked to some folks, but have not been aggressive. We've been building our team so that we have more gravitas now that we're going out, because initially it was the founders, and so we've brought on some strong people, and we have made some significant progress, but we really haven't yet had that big win. And in fact, this week, I'm participating in an investment conference that the National Cancer Institute, through their SBIR program, is paying for us to attend. So I did a pitch right before this meeting here. So we'll see how we did.
Yeah, best of luck.
I'll go next because I know James Dahlman's story and I can't compete with his story. So for us, building upon what Kenny keeps saying about getting this non-dilutive funding, right? So take advantage of that as much as you can, because there's a lot of opportunities out there, whether it be through GRA, Biolocity. There's also the SBIR, which I think Kenny also referenced. So there is some opportunity to get you to a point. And we went that route. And then like I said, we were talking to a bunch of different clinical users, and we came across one person who right off the bat wanted to invest in us, and we were at the point of no, we don't want to take money at this point, but he was just very, very interested. And so that's how we got our first investor. And to everybody out there, you always look back and you make a deal with the devil, is what it seems like, because you end up giving way more equity than you really should have, but we were too ignorant to know what to do. But now we're a little bit bigger. We were able to launch with that money, and we just closed out, like 2 months ago, we closed out a seed round. So we raised a little over $1 million because we just needed to expand for people to manufacturing. And we did that. And that really came from relationships. So talking to people. So you do your pitch and then they make a recommendation and they introduce you to somebody else. And we really tapped into this clinician network. Seems like all these doctors who really like what we're doing, they'd be interested, and then they would tell their friend, and then their friend would get interested, and they tell two friends. And so we actually, at the beginning, when you're starting to raise, you wonder if you're going to raise a penny. And once you get the first one, that's like, whew, okay, I got one. But then we got to the point where we actually had to turn people away at the end of it. So we actually had to say, no, we don't want any more money, which is a great problem to have. But it was all because to the momentum thing. It was just getting momentum. People were excited about it. They're telling their friends and their network. So that's how it worked for us. But we were not getting 10 and $20 million. We were just trying to get in the single digits.
Well, that's great.
So,
Still, congrats on
very
the
thankful.
round.
Very thankful.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
How about you, James?
All right, James Dahlman, you tell your amazing story now.
Okay, so we had an unusual story, which is what James is alluding to, in that we started the company. I think technically we started it in late 2018, but we didn't do our first experiment until May of 2019, and then our acquisition closed in February of 2021, which means for those of you in the audience who've been through one of these, it means it didn't start in February 2021. So we had a pretty quick turnaround, and I think the acquisition was also, a relatively good exit for us and for the investors. And we were fortunate in that we only had to raise a seed round, basically, before we got acquired. And again, I think this was mainly driven by just the platform was ready to go and the science was robust and the timing was good. The other thing I'd say though is that we did have some experience talking to people that would have been later stage investors, and we're able to drum up a good amount of interest from those folks. And I guess the thing I learned more than anything else is that all money isn't created equal. When I started, I thought, all money is green, so who cares? And you find out very quickly that the value of $1 from an investor varies quite a bit, because some investors basically write you a check and then, say, go make me rich. I think my favorite investor quote I had was almost verbatim. Was this person who wasn't really involved with the company, but somehow had some money in it or something, basically saying, well, we've invested in you, go make me rich, basically, or something that's ridiculous. Then you have other folks that, do a lot of work and help you to create value. And those dollars are really valuable because they introduce you to the right people who might want to buy you, or they introduce you to their other investor friends who might want to write big checks or whatever. They might help you with the slide deck. They might, give you just general advice very actively. And it's really investor dependent. So, a lot of times I think folks say, oh, we took money from this place or that place. And that's fine. Certain VCs have certain reputations, which I think, could be generally true. But a lot of times you're not really interacting with the VC firm, you're interacting with the person. And, and you can have a VC firm that has some great, really interactive people, and that same VC firm can have some people that aren't going to add a ton outside of the check. So, that's kind of how I think about it. I mean, all money isn't created equal. And I think we were very fortunate to have some very helpful people join our team. But, I think moving forward, whenever I do my next companies, I'm going to make sure that everybody around the table is, very helpful, because I've seen the value that can bring. But you got to be careful who you take money from. It's kind of weird because you're desperate for money, but you also have to take money. You have to be careful about who you take money from. So it kind of, to be honest, again, this is one of those kind of true things that is kind of sucks. Like this, this is one of those things, like you're in a bind, the person with a checkbook has the leverage, but you also need to make sure that you're getting a good person on your team. It's hard, and there's no magic bullet to it. It's just really hard.
Yeah, that's really difficult to thread that needle. And I think it's great advice. I guess, how would you recommend? I mean, I know it would differ if you're on your first company versus your second company and you've already kind of got your own reputation, but how would you recommend, early, maybe first-time entrepreneurs doing some like vetting or due diligence on potential investors? Because I could see this attitude of like, anyone who's going to give me money, I'll take it. It's just to get it off the ground. But do you have any advice for kind of how to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think the first thing is, we're big advocates in my lab, and I think at the company of not judging ourselves. And what I mean by that is like, or not criticizing yourself when you're speaking the truth, I guess. And so you may, as a first-time entrepreneur, you may be in a situation that you don't have the luxury of choosing who gives you money. And that's the truth. And it doesn't mean that you're stupid or a bad scientist. It just means that you haven't built up your reputation yet. And so people don't know you from Adam, so to speak, or Eve, and so they're not going to write you a check. If you're in that situation, you just got to be honest with yourself and say, you know what? I've done 100 pitches and I've gotten one check offer. That's a problem. And then in that case, you can vet all you want, but you need the money. Yep. If you're in a different situation where you have, some options, then you can do the vetting. And vetting is, actually relatively easy in the sense that all these people know each other and they all have reputations and so on. So this is not the type of vetting where you ask for their CV. This is the type of vetting where you have to kind of finagle and find people, stalk them on LinkedIn and find where they've worked before. And maybe you know somebody who knows somebody at one of those companies and how was this person, blah, blah, blah. But, it really is sort of like, it's not a CV vetting, it's a phone call vetting. That's how that stuff works. So, but again, I think that the biggest component is you have to be honest with yourself and non-judgmental about your situation. And, if you're a beggar, then beggars can't be choosers, and that's the rule. And if you are very, very lucky and you have multiple people, which is super rare, then, make some phone calls. That's what I would say. But don't be judgmental for yourself if you're a first-time person and you feel like you're begging. That's the way it works. Like, that doesn't mean you're doing a bad job. It's just, that's the way it is.
I would say I would look at who else they've invested in and try to talk to those people and say, what was your experience like? How were your interactions? Did they offer? Because James was talking about, right, smart money. Are they helping you progress further in either getting acquired or an exit, or in building your business and getting more accounts? Do they have some good relationships and connections? So that was useful for us because we did do that. We talked to some other people who had invested or got invested by certain groups, and we learned a lot of who to work with and who to not work with, because you don't want, I heard one investor was described as a constant thorn in the side of the company, and that's not somebody we were looking to work with.
And another
oh no, go ahead.
Another thing to consider is building your team, and so bring on some people who can help with the relationships, because with those of us who are new at being CEOs, then one can look at what we've done in our careers that are very impressive, but it's kind of like you're still new in that job. But part of being successful is to surround yourself with other successful, really smart, accomplished people. And there are people in Atlanta who have been very successful, who are willing to come on as advisors when they see a promising company in exchange for equity, so that you're not using your limited capital, but then having some of those people who can also help in making introductions to investors and telling you when something is a really bad deal. And that's where both GRA and Biolocity can probably help with looking at some of the terms and saying, looks great, or boy, you'd be a fool to do that.
We forgot to mention ATDC. I'm just sitting here thinking, I've talked to some great people, Bill Midget, some other people over at ATDC who have just been phenomenal. Sorry, John, that was like 3 questions ago.
No, you're good. I think it's still relevant to this conversation, just from the standpoint of expertise. I mean, someone mentioned earlier that as academics and entrepreneurs, we love to share and disseminate information. I found, there's reaching out to people who've been through this before, especially if they're also an alum of Georgia Tech or you have some relationship to them. People are very willing to serve in a mentor capacity or just have even a couple of conversations over coffee about what they've learned. So definitely don't think that you're in this alone, because you can't do it alone.
Yep.
Great. Well, I don't see any questions from the audience so far. So if the audience has any questions, again, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. We've got just a few minutes left here. But maybe pending any of those questions, but we'll have a couple to wrap up. Looking back on your journey so far, I guess, is there anything you would have done differently, starting from the beginning of your entrepreneurship journey? Any mistakes you made that you think you approach differently now? I see James kind of laughing.
I feel like I make mistakes all the time. I'm always learning. I guess I'll say it that way, right? I feel like I'm learning from my mistakes. I would think one of our failures, and again, because we're a lot of engineers, so we're thinking about the technology and not on the sales and marketing. That is outside of our skill set and our knowledge set. So I think one of our big lessons was that we don't know a lot about sales and how to do it, and marketing. And I think we still struggle with that right now. That's actually the number one question I've asked every other company here, is about their marketing strategy and what works and what doesn't work. But I wish we would have started it earlier than when we did, because you really need to do it before you hit the market. You need to be out there marketing, building, connections with hospitals or accounts, whatever you're selling it to. And you got to sell a little bit earlier. So sales and marketing is super important. Don't think the technology will just sell itself unless you have James Dolman's thing, right? You publish on the cover of Nature, then it just, right?
It's funny. I would say that so there's a bunch of mistakes I made in that first company that I can't talk about, but I will tell you, but that's like a 3 beer conversation, and then I'll, but I think, but I'm happy we made them. I mean, we learned from them. The second thing is, when I think about how we're going to do our future companies, there are different models for this. If you're an academic, there are different models. There's this sort of quantity model, and there are a few PIs that can pull this off, not many, but a few of them that can scattershot a lot of companies. And then there's another model that's just all quality based. My experience with Guide was that we had a really, really robust technology. And we happened to work with some great investors. That wasn't on purpose. I didn't know what I was doing, but it happened that we got some good investors. Knowing that, and still knowing how difficult it was, even though we had a great trajectory, acquired after the seed round, 1.5 years worth of, just crazy trajectory, it was still really hard. And what that taught me is, for company 2 or 3, whenever that comes out of the lab, I want the science to be as robust as the Guide science was. So really robust, not just robust enough to get a paper, but you do it 100 times, it works 100 times. Really robust. And the investors around the table have to be great investors, or I'm not doing it. Like, the amount of stress and anxiety and all this stuff that it generates, for me personally, as a personal decision, says that, like, if I don't have the right people around the table and a technology that's going to work every time, I'm not pulling the trigger, period. Because there are so many ways to fail, and you're still not guaranteed success if you have great investors and a great technology, but you're almost guaranteed not to succeed if you don't have some combination of those things. So that's what I would say. I mean, it was funny, like, I think my threshold for starting companies actually got higher than the threshold to raise money, if that makes sense. And that was the biggest lesson I took. Like, there will be opportunities to do something, and you may not want to do it. You may want to wait until until it's really going nuts, and then you can pull the trigger. But everybody has a different opinion. That's a very personal model and a very personal opinion. So that isn't gospel. That's just, personal opinion.
Sure. Thanks.
I saw that there was a question about conflict of interest, and particularly for folks who are still in academia. So I think that is an interesting thing to talk about. I can tell you that I myself have left academia, and when I took on the CEO role of Oncospherics, initially we had zero money, so I was getting zero salary, whereas the scientific founders were getting their salary from their universities. But they themselves have, the challenge on their day job versus the company. So we have two people here who still have their day job in academia. So perhaps I think that would be interesting to hear your perspectives on how you've been able to balance that and deal with the conflict of interest.
Hey, James, you mind if I take this one real quick? Because I have a hard stop at 12:30.
Yep.
So, and this, unlike my other answers, this is not long-winded. So basically, we put up a wall, and we really put up a wall. So, we were doing stuff in my lab. We were still barcoding in the lab, and the company was barcoding. We put up a wall. So, when we had the option of putting the company on campus versus putting it off campus, we put it off campus. I made it very clear to everybody that my lab members could not be talking about chemistry with their old friends who were in the company or whatever. Like, there was a wall that was put up, because I have seen other situations or heard of other situations before where maybe that wall isn't put up quite as robustly, and nothing ever happened, but you just go, God, like, ugh, like that would just keep me up at night. So, every time that you have a chance to separate what you're doing in the academic lab from what you're doing in the other entity and the company, always err on the side of separation. And if there's a line that you may not want to cross, don't walk up to the line, just like sprint in the other direction away from the line. And I have to go, but thank you all for having me. And I just wanted, that was my last answer. So
Thanks so much, James.
Yep.
So the question, Kitty, is about how to balance being in academia and in a company. I would say I balance very poorly. It's really, 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 really hard to do. It was manageable at the beginning, and now it's just like so unmanageable. This seems more like a therapy question. I'm always sit with some of the other entrepreneurs. Always feel like I'm having a therapy session, just talking about how to balance everything. And actually, in January, I'm taking a leave of absence because from Georgia Tech, because it's been it's time to focus more on the startup. So I have some stuff at Georgia Tech, but more of my time is going to be at the company, because it's very challenging to juggle both.
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty common refrain, that you kind of reach a tipping point where you've got to make a decision like that. But to the person who originally asked that question, another advice I'll give is, just get in contact with your university's conflict of interest office early. Tell them I'm planning on doing this. I want to make a company. We're working on this, because they will help you form that management plan for your COI. And it can, give you details on how to build that wall that James was talking about, or what conversations you should or shouldn't have. So they're usually pretty savvy at navigating that. We're a few minutes over. Oh, sorry, James. You had
I just want to say don't be afraid about the conflict of interest. Conflict of interest isn't a problem for me. It's the time balance is a problem for me. But when I went to the conflict of interest office, the guy told me that conflicts of interest are a great thing. They want to have them. So don't be ashamed to go in there. They love having them. It's just making sure we're managing them appropriately, and that we're not spending money where we shouldn't be, or having things do the wrong way. It's about following it the right way. And if you do that, then that's fine. But conflicts of interest are a great problem to have.
Great. And I think that's definitely fair. And it looks like I know we've got to wrap up, but Kenny, if you've got a couple minutes, we had a question come in just a few minutes ago saying, regarding drug development, what is your perspective on focusing on early animal studies versus pilot, clinical, or human trials in order to gain reputability?
Well, we had the advantage that we had evidence of efficacy in some animal models, and so getting very keen to go forward to human trials. One of the things that I've developed an appreciation for is how complicated with us, it's small molecules, and so the whole process of manufacturing, formulation, and whatnot, it's going to cost us over $1 million to get to the point that we can address the FDA requirements, even before making sufficient drug to be able to put into humans. And so making that type of investment in a compound to put into humans, it's not trivial, and a lot of our effort is on that right now. But feeling comfortable in putting that effort in, having preclinical evidence of efficacy makes me more comfortable doing that. And then the other thing is having, some information on how the drug is handled in metabolism in different species can also give you some comfort in being able to take things forward. So there are a number of things that we do in animals, including toxicity too, long before taking it to human clinical testing. There's some other things, though, that one can go pretty quickly to clinical testing if you're talking about, like, stem cells and some biologics. So that's different. But if there's any manufacturing involved, there are a lot of hoops you have to jump through.
Makes sense. Thanks for that perspective. All right, well, we're a few minutes over, so I think we're going to have to wrap this up. If anyone had any other questions, feel free to follow up with us after the webinar, and we'd be happy to point you to some resources to help out. But thank you again to our panelists so much. I think this was a great conversation. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining. And please take a look at our schedule for our next Bench2Market talk. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.